Rendering your Revit project in Enscape is actually really easy. The only trick is you need Enscape. To get Enscape, you need to download it and you need to install it after you've installed Revit. So, a lot of you have probably already installed SketchUp and then installed Enscape into SketchUp. You'll need to go back to the Enscape webpage, and there's an update, usually, that you can download. And once you install that update, it will automatically detect that Revit is on your computer, and it will allow you to render using Revit. And basically it works the same as in SketchUp. There's kind of a live view. You can synchronize the two views, or you can just have it synchronized with what's called the Revit Live Camera. Revit Live Camera is a feature where you can kind of zoom around 3D views using arrow keys and whatnot. But unless you have two screens, the synchronized view is probably fine. And also the other elements here, you'll see there is the asset library, which we saw in SketchUp. There's the Enscape material library and the Enscape material editor. These are the same as in SketchUp. You can load these materials into your project, and then you can modify the materials here in your Revit interface. But otherwise, Revit will take all of your materials and all of your lighting that's in your project. The only thing it will not do is it will not respect if you have dimmed or turned off any lighting using the onboard render menu that we saw before. So for that, you'll have to actually create separate families of lights that you want to dim. So let's launch Enscape and take a look. It should look very familiar. Click the Start button, and of course it will launch based on your current view and start in the familiar Enscape interface, which looks like this. And it should have all the familiar buttons that we have seen in the past. First of all, the look of the image is a little bright. There is the whole visual settings menu, and I'm not going to go into all of these, but you probably remember that there's any number of things you can do to change the quality of the image. If it's running slowly, you can drag this down to medium, and it will go a little faster. There are image settings for contrast, motion blur, lens flare, bloom, all these fun things that we can fiddle around with. We can add, we can modify the sun brightness and also the artificial light brightness. You can also just kind of reset these to where they were. And of course, there's all the other things. The ambient brightness is sometimes handy if you have a lot of interior views. And of course, anytime you have a night view, the artificial lighting becomes primary. The background, you can add things like an urban site or something like that. Again, you only see it when it is visible, when your model isn't blocking all that stuff in the background. And finally, don't forget to set your output settings. Normally, it's set to full HD, but you can set it as high as 8,000 pixels. But Ultra HD is going to be a high-quality image. You can see it's close to the 4,000 that we got when we were downloading images from the cloud rendering system. So let me close this. We'll go through some of the Revit-specific things. First of all, it takes your geolocation, the sun, all that from the Revit model. So if you want to change your north-south, east-west orientation, it's probably best to do that in the model. And there are some other features. There's this collaborative annotation, which allows you to collaborate with other people, get comments from them, that sort of thing. We won't be using that. Under the BIM mode, it's also a kind of a collaborative feature where you can find sub-elements inside the project. So if you're wondering, well, wait a sec, what's causing, I don't know, that light, or what are those light fixtures? You can kind of mouse over objects and it will kind of highlight them, or you can select them here in the view and it will actually show them here in the BIM menu. Kind of handy if you're not sure what you're going on or if you're looking at someone else's project. As for view management, like you saw with SketchUp, you can have multiple views. Any of the views in your project, you can kind of quickly jump to them. So if I want to go to the nighttime exterior rendering, I can jump to that. Now, because it doesn't really respect the Revit lighting settings, you can see it looks exactly the same. So I would need to use my adjusters, holding down the Shift key and dragging the right mouse button to change the view, and all of your lighting is working just fine. And in this view menu, you can do a couple of things. You can star it, and this is great if you're doing an augmented reality presentation. This becomes a node that you can click on. You can also save the Enscape sun position, and this is really nice if you have made some modifications. And then just hit save. You can have multiple starred images. And you can, once you've modified this view, you can go to another view. I think this one is one of my interior views. And you can see it might take Enscape a minute to figure out what the adjustment is for exposure, but it should modify fairly quickly. And you can jump back to the nighttime rendering. It should remember that view. One fun thing you can do is you can add assets to the view here live just by going to the asset library. It's not ideal, but we can type in some feature. It does take a while to load, unfortunately. I think that's true when you're applying assets in the main model as well. So here are my assets, and you can just drag them into your view here. And what's cool, you can try to drag it in. Come on, you can do it. And place it wherever you think it's appropriate. Now, I will say placing things in 3D is a little tricky because you don't always know where it is. There's kind of foreshortening going on. So I prefer to put them in plan, but this is great when you've realized you've forgotten something. The other thing is when you hit apply changes, it will send it back to your Revit model. So you'll go back and you'll see that asset, the Enscape asset, which is usually kind of clunky looking, in your main model. If you go to your main model, you'll see it's giving you this same menu where it's telling you, oh, I'm loading that into your model. You can see it's a good deal slower than just placing the objects in your Revit plan. And here it is in the plan view. And of course, any changes you make will be updated in your Enscape view. So it is kind of an interesting way to modify your project. You can see when I make that changes, it exports it back out to the Revit model. The image jumps. Another interesting feature is this site context, and it will ask you, hey, well, where's your site? Please add one. And it will try to find your current location and load in any topography that it can find. So I typed in our address at Endicott, and you can expand or contract what is available in the map just by clicking and dragging these grippers, and it goes on to OpenStreetMap and tries to find any information it can. So I'll click import and we'll see what we get. But unfortunately, you can see that it's actually not all that great. And what I believe it does is it puts it in the background like you would have your, say, buildings or forests or whatnot. I believe that's why it works that way. So you can always go back and add your forest in behind the buildings. If it's an urban context, I think this would work better. But right now, it's not terrific. It doesn't really show a whole lot. Those urban contexts, however, are really great. Now, I just plunked our model in the middle of the park in Boston and got a kind of square of downtown Boston. But you can see that's actually not too bad. For a lot of projects, though, the topography is a little fuzzy. But if we were building in front of the State House, boy, this would be awesome. And it does help to have a site perspective saved. It will not open up a site plan view, so it's nice to have that site perspective. And while that geometry does not load into the model, you can render the image into the model, and it should stay right in your project. And here it is in your project browser under renderings. It's just a still image, so not as good as getting all those buildings in there. And like with the version for SketchUp, you can create a view from what you're looking at. It has the cute little icon here, and that will save a view with this current setting. We could call it whatever site, and it will add it back in, and that will show up in your 3D drawings in Revit. Let's talk about Enscape materials. And basically, Enscape materials take the properties from Revit materials, but it's a little more complicated, and there are a lot more options, or many more options, not a huge number. And I went to the Enscape website here, and they have a whole discussion of Revit materials. And one of the biggest things to realize is that Revit materials already have a lot of sophisticated properties. And here they have a nice description of what some of those look like. I like playing with these sliders, and you can kind of see the roughness versus glossiness. The bump map, which, as you might imagine, kind of takes an image and turns it into a bumpiness pattern, and it can be more or less bumpy depending on your settings in the materials library. And finally, the bump map image, if it's black and white, and a lot of these can use an image that is a black and white image. Where it is black, it is sticking out, and where it is white, it is sticking in, and you can actually flip that and reverse it. And a lot of these work that way. For example, I like this one. It's a glossiness map meaning an image, that is the basis for how it chooses what is glossy and what is not. So as you have areas that are black and areas that are white, you can change what's glossy or not. Other fun ones, and this is where you can really create some interesting things, you can create a cutout texture. And this allows you to actually kind of create geometry that is three-dimensional by just drawing a two-dimensional pattern. You see how this is actually a kind of warped a sphere that has this checkerboard pattern applied to it, and it cuts out the material. Anyway, there's other things that you can do. You can offset the rotation of the image. You can change the tint of the image. As we have seen, you can have self-illumination and also color temperature. And again, these are all things that we have fiddled around with inside the Revit materials menu. Also, the image fade. This is important because sometimes you don't want a full strength image. Sometimes you want to have it a little bit softer, particularly when you're picking images off of the internet. They can be a little bit much sometimes. Anyway, and then there's things like metal, and down here we have refraction, which is kind of how much light is bent. And you can imagine this is a good example, kind of like a soap bubble. There's more of a soap bubble versus less of a soap bubble. Finally, you can have a map that is a self-illumination map. This is great if you want, say, a neon sign, and without having to actually model a three-dimensional neon tube. And there are so many other things. Hardwood tint is a nice one. Finally, some of the materials like grass and glass are basically just objects inside the Revit materials library that have been given a class. So you can have a glass or grass class inside the Revit materials library. And each of those do have their own unique properties. So again, glass, it's actually quite complicated because it's transparent, but it's also reflective, and can be glossy, or it can be fritted. It can be a matte color. And finally, of course, you can tint the glass. And these different material types, as mentioned, they can be selected in the class type within Revit. However, Enscape has its own internal materials editor, which we saw in using Enscape for SketchUp. And there are a number of different parameters or kind of general, classifications that you can see. Obviously, generic is kind of what you get when you haven't chosen anything else. But carpet will automatically build up a carpet pattern for you, and there are some controls for the height of the carpet. Clear coat, it's meant to kind of imitate refraction that you get from car finishes, which are multi-layered. Foliage is a good one, particularly if you have, say, vines growing on a building, or even more dramatically, vines that are hanging down that may have the sun lighting through them. It kind of controls some of the, or gets rid of some of the brightness that you associate when you have just a kind of cutout image. Finally, self-illuminated, well, yeah, we know that. Self-illuminated is something that glows. And water, of course, looks like water. And one of the cool things about these materials is water in particular is animated as you move through the Enscape window. Well, you can also have a video texture, so not just kind of animating the blades of grass blowing in the wind, for example, or waves on the water. You can actually have a video file as your kind of image, your map, this is all done, again, in the menu, the Enscape Materials Editor. And I particularly like this Enscape webpage that has all sorts of information about the materials and how they work in Revit, partly because it just has a good description of how certain features work about these materials. It has a graphical thing, which I find the Revit onboard materials editor, you just kind of have to fiddle with the sliders to see what it looks like, whereas here it kind of gives you a preview of that single factor when you modify it. For example, the height map, which controls how much something sticks out. Now, this is a little different than a bump map. A bump map, I guess the dimension is actually the main factor. The height map can actually displace the surface quite significantly and make it really seem like there's, for example, a shadow on stone or on a brick grout line. And it depends how much you drag the slider. As you drag it past kind of a central area, that angle and that distance becomes kind of magnified greatly. And this is called a normal map. Normals is basically the direction that a surface is facing. And you can imagine that a normal can be up or down, for example, on a ground-based surface. And you can drag that normal map up and really create a very dramatic kind of bump. Anyway, go over to that website and you will see some really great descriptions of how each of these works in terms of Enscape and also the Revit materials. Now, most of you have actually used these already in your life in SketchUp. So Enscape has its own materials library, and this is very much akin to our own asset library that we've seen in Revit. And you can choose materials. And what's nice about using these materials, first of all, if you've been using SketchUp and these materials in SketchUp, they look the same. So you can quite quickly have materials that match regardless of which platform you're using. And as you probably have experienced with using Enscape for SketchUp, the menus can take a while to load. Now, I have heard that if you just leave it up and let it spend all day loading, and if you click on the All button, and this is the same for the asset library, that once that's loaded, the preview icons will be sort of preloaded the next time, but it never seems to work for me. Maybe I'm just not patient enough or my computer goes to sleep. But anyway, if you want a material, here we'll use some rubber tar. You can select it. I believe you can select more than once by just holding down Control. You can also star it if it's one of your favorites. And just import the selection. And it will tell you down at the bottom that, yes, you have imported those materials. And just be aware these materials are stored locally on your machine. If you click down here at the little cog, it tells you where that is, and it is not in your project folder. Now, of course, these are Enscape textures, not custom ones that you have added images with, so they should show up on any machine that has Enscape. However, if you are collaborating, working in an office, there's some advanced advice here on how to handle shared folders. And interestingly enough, it does actually take some time for these materials to be imported. There's a lot of information there, but we are patient. The hardest part about using Enscape materials is finding them in the darn library. Here they are under Road, so it does actually make sense to remember what name you used what name they had in the Enscape library. Anyway, you'll see here that there are a lot of parameters here. In this case, there's some images that have come down with it that control the lines that you see. So to apply one of these materials, obviously these are roads, so they kind of make sense to be used outside. I have this site that we made at the beginning, so I do need to either make a subregion or just split the surface into two, which is what I did. When you do that, typically the materials are applied in the properties of the topography, so I can just go here, click through, and again, this is an instance parameter, right? Let's try road number 1. I think that one works pretty well. Click OK. Now, of course, I don't really see it. I could go to Enscape, but I also could just choose Realistic View. You can see here, oh, maybe that's not so good. I'll choose road. Let's choose road number 3. Maybe that only has a single line. and it does. And then the problem is the lines are facing the wrong way. Now, I could look for a single line and say, oh, that's going to be my parking spot and delineators, and then I'll just have that as parking spots, which is actually kind of handy. But instead, I can also edit the material and rotate that 90 degrees so that the white lines show up where I want them to do along the edge of the parking. Now, there are two ways to edit it. I could go through the good old Revit materials library and go to Manage and Materials, and then find the material, which is conveniently right here, and then click on the image to bring up the materials editor and change the rotation here. And we've done that, change it 90 degrees. However, I can also go and use the Enscape materials editor. And frankly, they do the same thing, and it will be remembered in the project. Either way, the project will recognize that the material has changed. So what you'll see here is materials that are unused have a little, unused Enscape materials have a little orange symbol next to them. And I can just click on the box to open up the materials. And now when you actually have the image, you can just click on the image and there's an option to rotate. And, you know, interesting enough, it basically does the same thing that the Revit menu does. So whichever your feelings are for convenience is fine. They'll both do the same end result. And in fact, you can see here in my model that the lines have changed, and I think I'm going to go with that one. Okay, let's take a look at some more complex materials and how they look different in Enscape and the Revit interface. And basically, most things look the same, although interesting enough, in Revit, if you orbit your model around, you notice how the shadow always faces the same direction, which is a little weird. And the reason is it's the way that the sun settings are done. If you go here and you right-click on the sun path, you should see the sun settings, or just click on the icon. And by default, it is set to have an altitude and an azimuth, and is relative to the view. Just happens to be the default way it's shown. If you click Still Image, now you can pick an exact time and an exact location. And of course, we could browse for the exact location of our imaginary project. I think I'm just going to go with Boston, Massachusetts. And of course, it picks your current date, and it puts the shadows on the ground level, which of course makes a lot of sense. And hit Apply and OK. And you should see both windows update with the new shadow settings. Oh, I turned my shadows off. And now when I orbit the model, the shadows remain where they're supposed to instead of moving around. And by the way, if you're really looking to do a kind of solar study of your project, you can do this. First of all, you can turn on the solar sun path here. And what that does is it shows your kind of altitude and azimuth of the sun based on different times of year. And you can actually drag the sun. And sometimes this is a little nicer than setting the time of day. You can drag the sun, and you'll see that the shadow should change based on the position of the sun. And that is both during the day and during the year. Obviously, the sun moves during the course of the year. And that's a great diagram to include on your board, something like that. And you can actually do a solar study, which is great because it can show the sun. I'm just going to zoom in on my window a little bit. You can make a still, or you can show these different times of year quite quickly. The summer solstice, of course, is the middle of the summer, and so hence the shortest shadows, the longest day, and you can compare that to the winter solstice and what your project might look like. This is particularly important on exterior of buildings when you want to determine just how light or dark an exterior surface is going to be, what the conditions on the facade might look like, the shadows and whatnot. You can also include for studies how deep the lighting is going to get and how bad things like glare might be. In January, look how long that shadow is. You're going to have a lot of issues on east and west facing windows. And this is a great way to actually show that. Anyway, and Revit can produce a still image of various types here. I'll just let good old Revit explain it to you. And this still image obviously just shows the shadows where they are, but you can study an animation of what the shadows might look like in a single day, or actually on a multi-day study. These are great for showing what a project might look like over the course of a day or over the course of a year. And the way you see what it looks like, you can play. I'll even play it in a loop. And of course, your computer may go bananas when you try to do this, and your fan may go off and your computer may crash. But this makes for a great solar study to see what your project conditions are going to be like over the course of a year. So if you're like me and you're like, oh boy, this is going to be bad on my computer, you can absolutely export that as an animation. Just go to File, Export. Down at the very bottom, there's an Images and Animations. And so far, we haven't really looked at this much, but there's a couple of things you can export here. A solar study is a great one. Just export that. You can do things like set the frame rate so that it's nice and smooth, and also the quality of the image and how nice it's going to look. We'll just do shaded with edges so that it doesn't take the rest of my life to do. Anyway, and you can include a date stamp, which is kind of handy. The only problem with exported single-day studies in right from Revit is that they're awfully slow. So it's not, or awfully quick, so they go so quickly you can't actually see them. You have to use a movie editor to slow them down to see what's going on. You can see here's the one I created, and it only has 7 frames, so it's awfully quick. So what if we wanted to create that solar study in good old Enscape? Well, then we can get a much longer video. Obviously, it takes a little bit more effort to set it up, but it's kind of nice you use the video editor. And just like we saw in SketchUp, the video editor works with keyframes. In this case, we can click the plus sign here to add a keyframe right at the beginning. That's what this little triangle is. If you click on the triangle, it actually shows you what features there are of the keyframe, what parameters, and you can change the time of day. So, for example, I can make this but the crack of dawn. Let's see, we'll go with 5 a.m. so it's nice and dark. Let's start at 4, for example. And OK, and then what we'll do, I'll click the plus sign to add a keyframe at the end. So there's basically 2 keyframes, and I'll click on this one, and I'll make the time of day. I'll make it at night. Okay, so that the entire video should scroll through the whole day. And as we did in SketchUp, you can hit the play button, and it should show you what that looks like, nice and slow. And there you go. You get a very compelling solar study. Of course, you can dramatize this by fiddling around with artificial lighting and other settings to make a really interesting export. But anyway, if all else fails, just click Export, and you can save your video onto your computer. So I've made a couple of materials here that we can use. I've actually imported them from the Enscape library. And let's put these 2 views both in perspective view. I'm in the default 3D view, the orthographic view. You can actually change it to perspective. It's kind of interesting. It doesn't look hugely different, but if for whatever reason you want the views to kind of be more matching, like I do, you can do that. Anyway, and then I've made just a random shape here that I can modify. If I check the properties here, I did in fact make a material parameter, an instance material parameter. That way I can just change it very quickly and show you what I've done. What have I done? Well, I've imported a couple of materials. So let's take a look at some of the basic materials imported from Enscape. I'll just come and change this. Of course, as I mentioned, you got to remember the name of the object you brought in. I believe this was one of the ones that I brought in, Brick 03. Click OK. And like magic, your model becomes brick. And I am in realistic view, but sometimes I find that Revit's realistic view is not as revealing. You see how it hasn't updated? I'm not quite sure why that is, if it's just my graphics card can't keep up. So I think I'll leave this in shaded view for now. Of course, this isn't terribly realistic, having brick like this, but let's take a look up close at one of the features, which is the bump map and the kind of vertical normal map. Just zoom in. I'm using my mouse to zoom in and out, so obviously you'll have to do this on your own. And you can see here on the side there's already some depth to this material that is quite pronounced. But let's take a look at it under the materials editor here in Enscape. And of course I have to remember which one I used. I think it was this one. And the height map, the displacement map, we can drag this over and watch what happens. See how it gets even deeper? I can also drag it the other way. If you drag it past 0, the height map actually goes the other way, and it gets pretty freaky pretty fast. Obviously, this material was designed with a particular height map in mind, but you can see on the side here, it's trying to push that grout the other way. Now, because of the shadowing, it looks weird. It just looks very strange. Here in the menu under height map, the image that it has is actually called normal. So a normal map, often when you go online, you can find materials that are meant for rendering in this setting, and they actually have normal maps. Otherwise, you can create them by just making a image in Photoshop and desaturating it, turning it into black and white. And I believe that's what this reflections menu is. If I click on it, you'll see that there's basically a grayscale image. Anything that is darker is going to stick out a little more, and anything that's lighter is going to move back. And of course, I can tweak the image in Photoshop before bringing it in. I can also invert it. What you'll see is that the bricks should be uneven, but in a slightly different way. And what's nice about that is you can tweak your image quite a lot. Finally, the albedo is the original kind of photograph of the brick. And again, you can see here that it's quite neat. In fact, this looks to me suspiciously like it was created in Photoshop rather than a photograph. Finally, you can change the dimension if you want really big or really small brick. What it will do is, I'll just make this a little smaller. Fortunately, it's always in metric because everybody else uses metric. And you can see that the brick pattern gets larger or smaller. Remember that most of these materials are meant to be scaled architecturally in your rendering, so modifying it, I now have itty-bitty little bricks in my project. Anyway, you can also control rotation, and this is great if you have materials in different spots in your model, and sometimes you want the brick to go one way or another. Just be aware, it can look a little funky and of course quite unrealistic. Having brick on a curved surface like I have honestly makes no sense whatsoever, but it sure makes a good demonstration. And here's a look at the corrugated steel material. Again, the material comes in right from the Enscape library. I'll go back here to my material editor and we can modify the material here, if you can remember which one it was. I believe it was corrugated steel. Yeah, that sounds good. And again, this looks a little big to me, given the size of my model, so I can come in and I can change it like we did before. Another kind of steel that I imported is fencing. This is a great material, and it gives a good example of how a material can be set up to have cutout maps. Of course, I could try and find a 3D model of a steel fence, but that would be a nightmare. Instead, the steel fencing is great. It has basically an image of a fence that they have cut out so that it's either transparent where there isn't fence or that's solid where there is fence. And let me take a look at the image file here. You can see it's basically a tiny little piece of fence. In fact, again, I think they probably drew this in Photoshop or more likely Illustrator. So you can use that. And the cutout image, see, anything that's black is cut out. Anything that's white is not cut out. And I can invert this. So now I have basically a wall with a mesh cutout. Now, structurally, how that works is a whole other issue. And then the normal map is how bumpy it is. This is what makes the fence look like it's rounded. See how there's kind of a gradient of light? And again, these can be found online, and you can create these using Photoshop, particularly if you have, say, a building facade where you want to wrap it in a very particular kind of mesh. You're actually designing that mesh. You could go into Photoshop, just design essentially one piece of this mesh that gets marched out along the whole object. And do be aware, of course, there, once again, I hate to bring in reality, but the edges of this fence here are a little impossible, right? So it doesn't really look like the fence is kind of warped over this whole surface. That's a lot more tricky to do, and in fact, you'd probably need to draw in some elements for structural pieces. Now, along this same vein, I created a material from, I just went to the 3form website, and I got an image of their material here. It's called Connection Ink. Of course, they give you seamless materials, so that's obviously really great. And then I used both a transparency map and a cutout map here. And I just basically created this image, took the base image and used Photoshop to create a black and white image. Again, you can do all sorts of other stuff. I could make it be glowing. And the transparency map, what that allows me to do is kind of tweak how much it fades. So in this case, if I didn't want to have the cutout, this transparency map would allow me to have essentially a grid of, it's a little hard to see, let me make this a little bigger, a grid of parts that were more transparent and parts that are less transparent. But I think I'm going to go with the cutout grid just because it looks cooler in the in the model. So click apply, and like before, I could reverse it and whatnot. There is a little bit of fringing going on with the image, so I might want to touch that up in Photoshop. But click apply and OK. I was just picking it in the menu, and you can see here that it makes a pretty funky kind of material. Now, obviously, it doesn't always make sense, like our other meshes, to have it just kind of be the structural element in addition to the finish element. So you may want to make this as a single extruded surface. And here's what that looks like, just a single flat surface, an extruded piece. Looks okay. And now let's take a look at another material I made. I'll just select this object again like I've been doing and use my instance parameter to change the material. Let's choose etched glass. And sometimes you won't see the change right away. This is kind of an annoying problem with Enscape and Revit not communicating. They're not talking to each other. And you can try pausing and then restarting live updates sometimes. That'll bring about the change, and sometimes just relaunching the Enscape window. This is particularly true when you change component parameters. Enscape doesn't always recognize it, particularly things like materials and lighting, by the way, more so lighting than anything else. If you change the sub-parameters of an individual light family, it might not recognize it right away. Anyway, looking at the etched glass material that I created, it's basically just a piece of glass. I can even give it a color here. I didn't think to do that. And in the preview here, what you'll see is that I've created a transparency map, and the transparency map is an image that's a black and white image. Okay, and like before, I can invert the image, but let's take a look at what it looks like initially. And there's a whole bunch of different things that you can modify here, including how much the image is visible, which will change how much is actually removed from your image. And by the way, these each of these sliders has like a helpful tooltip. I would absolutely use those tooltips, recommend using those tooltips, partly because I can never remember which way modifies what. As you drag these, for example, 0% transparency means that it's 100% opaque, and sometimes you just don't get a quick feedback from the image here, the preview, because your computer just can't operate that quickly. Anyway, these materials, they often don't look exactly as you would expect in the preview here, and so I've added a tint to it, and again I've used my image here to modify what it looks like. But when I actually click apply and OK, it looks a little different in my model. Now what it's done is it's basically made my wall completely transparent except where those letters were, where the black letters were. And with those, they are as transparent as the setting in the material. So here's where maybe using the Enscape material editor is a little more, I don't know, visually apparent what you're doing. And what I find is that unless you're using a material that came from Enscape, that sometimes the communication between Enscape and Revit isn't great. For example, I did change this color, albedo color, but it doesn't always update or it doesn't always accept that. Here, let's try using the tint color. See if we can get it to work there. Oh, yep, there we go. Anyway, and then the other things you can make the glass more or less opaque. See how as I drag it over, it's becoming more and more thin, as opposed to as I drag this over, now the tinted glass becomes much more apparent. So obviously this is not perfect. Maybe what I need is a different image for my transparency. I created two images here. One that is basically just black and white. You can see here I've got the images that I needed for a couple things. I was going to do some bamboo rings if I didn't like the way these looked, but these looked fine. But here I've got a black and white image and then a kind of gray and white image. I'll choose that one. And I actually created it in PowerPoint of all things, which is kind of ridiculous. Anyway, when you bring these images in, I do find sometimes there's a little variability in the way Enscape behaves. For example, I was kind of expecting this to have the glass be the other way, but I guess I figured it out backwards. Anyway, so I can reverse the image. I can invert it and get basically what looks like a glass wall with blue etching on it. And then you can change the blue etching if you want. You can modify the tint and the color. So I made this, I didn't like the blue quite so much. And then you can control kind of how pronounced it is, either by just by dragging the opacity down. See, now it has more of an etched kind of look to the glass. And this would be great if you have, say, signage on the outside of an office or on the front of a building etched into the glass. Again, tweaking the image to get just the look that you want is tricky, but well worth the effort. In the end, you do have to make new materials using the Revit materials library, and so you may feel more comfortable editing those materials and their parameters in the Revit library, or you may prefer importing materials from the Enscape library. And actually, you can use those, like I did here, to create a custom material, for example, using the fence, but getting a different image or drawing for the base part of the fence. Either way, Enscape is a great tool for rendering your Revit models, and what's really nice is it's almost instantaneous. You get to see your changes, and that to me is its greatest value. You don't spend a lot of time waiting for the cloud renderings to be completed.